Okay, we are now recording, and okay. So what I wanted to start with, kind of the favorite story that you just told Allison and I that I'd never heard before.
What was that?
And I know you told it at dinner the other night. But starting with, because it's such a cool story, starting with the Phil Spector, David Bowie, John Lennon encounter. So tell me about that.
Well, it's not very complicated. I mean, I was representing David Bowie. I did two major things for him, which is he wanted to get, he was signed to a long-term, overreaching contract with a manager by the name of Tony DeFries. And he was having trouble he wanted to get out of the contract. So he was brought to me by Michael Lippman, who did some miscellaneous things for Bowie, and so I handled that case, Tony DeFries, and I got rid of Tony DeFries on his behalf, and got rid of that. The next thing I was doing was he did a movie called The Man Who Fell to Earth, and I negotiated the contract for that movie. I did a couple other miscellaneous things, and while I was representing him, I was in New York for something. I don't remember why I was in New York at this particular time. And I got a call from Phil Spector, who had been my long-term client from sometime in the 60s. And he said, I'm going down to see Bowie. He's recording. Would you like to come with me? I have a limo. I said, great. So he said, meet me downstairs at whatever time, 2 o'clock, whatever time, I don't remember. So I was in a hotel. I can't remember what hotel. And so I went down, got in the limo, and there was John Lennon. We then drove all the way downtown New York.
John Lennon was in the limo.
Yeah, he was with Phil Spector. Then we drove downtown, somewhere downtown New York, all the way down, I don't remember, the 20s or something like that. I can't remember exactly. Into the studio, and he was in the middle of doing Fame, recording Fame. And then we stayed around for a while he was recording, and at some point we left. I don't remember what nothing particular happened other than we were listening to the playbacks and things like that.
So hanging out in the studio with Bowie and Lennon and Phil Spector.
Yeah.
So what year was that approximately? I'm going to ask you for a lot of dates because I want to string all this together.
But it's probably one could probably find the date that he recorded Fame.
Okay, and the movie The Man Who Fell to Earth.
That was before that.
Before that, okay. And so because I want to come back to Bowie, you mentioned that.
To the best of our recollection, it was before that. I can't be positive. But those, I negotiated the Man Who Fell to Earth probably within 6 months before he filmed it. So.
And did you get to know John Lennon also? I mean,
not really.
No. So at the time, you were representing Phil Spector before Bowie, right?
Yes.
And how did you meet Phil Spector, and how did you come to represent him? And approximately, like when did that happen?
Yeah, I remember where I was. My office was on South Beverly Drive, 315 South Beverly Drive at the time. So this would have been approximately 6 years after I started practicing law, approximately. And I was at 315 South Beverly Drive. I was sharing it with another lawyer. His name I can't think of at the moment, Ed something or other. My secretary at the time was probably both Jeannie Rennick and Irma Alniger.
I remember both of them.
So I got a call one evening I got a call one day from Andy Feynman. Andy Feynman was a lawyer in New York I knew. He was representing Phil. And he said, Phil's coming out to the West Coast, although Phil came from the West Coast, but he was living in New York at that time. He's coming out there He wants to sign a group that's on Moonglow Records. He said, can you meet with him? I said, sure. When's he going to be here? He'll be here Friday. When will he be here? Sometime in the evening. So Phil, it was a Friday evening, and Phil showed up. I would say somewhere around 9 o'clock in the evening. I was still there. And also came in, I can't remember his name, it's easily to find, the owner of Moonglow Records. I think he was German. I think he had a German accent. And I had a few minutes with Phil before we met with the guy from Moonglow Records. And Phil told me what he wanted. He wanted to sign this group. I never heard of this group. It was Bobby Hatfield and what's his name? The Righteous Brothers, the two guys.
Oh, okay. I don't remember their names. But
Bobby Hatfield and the other one. We can find the name easily enough. Why don't we look it up? Right here.
Let me pause it while you do that. All right, so you figured out the name. It was
Bill Medley and Bobby Hatfield. Let's see if I can find who owned Moonglow Records. Let me find that.
looking up the answer box.
He changed his name to Ray Maxwell.
So that was the owner of
Moonglow Records.
Moonglow Records.
So that's who I met with that night with Phil. He wanted certain monies and all that. We agreed to the terms. Some of these things, I can't talk about because they've been...
No, I mean, obviously.
So we agreed to the terms, and so we were able to sign the Righteous Brothers to Phyllis Records. Phyllis Records was a label established by Phil along with Lester Sill. That's why it was called Phyllis.
Oh.
Phyllis, okay. Lester Sill was out of the company at that time. So Phil owned it by himself. So Phil had, the interesting part about it was, Phil had, I think, 30 days, something like that, to release the record. There was a release period. He had to release it. And he called me like 29 days later, and he said, I need an extension. So I got him an extension. I think I got 2 more extensions. And then on December 15th of that year, I think it was 1968, I'll have to look it up, out comes, it was December 15th, that I remember.
How do you remember that date?
I don't know, because it's an unusual time to release a record.
Oh, all right.
That's not a Christmas record. December 15th, out came You've Lost That Love and Feeling. Which is one of the all-time, probably the most played recording of all time.
So Loving Feeling was the single, obviously, but was that the name of the album also?
I don't remember the name of the album.
So they released the single on that date?
The album followed. He let Bill Medley produce a couple of tracks. Phil didn't really care about the rest of it. He was only interested in the hit. Let me see what year it came out. I've always been bothered by that.
Okay, I'm going to pause. I'm starting again. So it came out in 1965.
And that was 1965.
So,
all right. That was the year I started representing Phil, and that record came out December 15, 1965.
So when I'm going to talk about the Wall of Sound. So this was before the Wall of Sound or after the Wall of Sound?
Wall of Sound was what he created before I met him.
So he was already big at this point.
Yes, he had the Ronettes and the Crystals, all that side to his label. He would go into the studio, mostly Gold Star in Hollywood, and he would just build layer upon layer of sound.
But I was going to ask, what is the wall of sound exactly? And
That is
what artists
layers
were-
of sound. Layers.
What does
of
that
sound.
mean?
Well, he would go one group on top of another group on top of another group.
Simultaneous? You mean
No, not that, but you do them in Tragedy. He would bring in eight mandolins and record them and send them home. Then he'd bring in 8 whatever other instruments and record them. Then they'd layer on top of each other.
so the wall of sound, which was very famous? What artists utilized that sound?
Well, our artist didn't utilize it. Phil utilized it.
Well, he used it with what artists?
A lot. That you can look up on the
Okay,
internet.
I'll look that up. Now, just one of my favorite stories that you've ever told about Phil Spector was the deposition story. So I wanted you to tell that story. When did that happen? So you were still litigating, obviously, so sometime after 65.
It was sometime after 65.
And you were still litigating, so you went into a deposition with Phil Spector. Tell me about that.
Well, what happened was Phil Spector was asked to be the host of a television show called The Dave Clark Five. It was a half-hour television show, and they had rotating hosts featuring the Dave Clark Five. And in this particular one, Phil was the host, and it was a half-hour show. And Phil was living on a street called La Colina in Beverly Hills, and I found this house for him. And the house, when you drive up La Colina, which is one of the first streets into Beverly Hills off of Sunset, from Sunset, one of the very first streets. You drive in all the way down the street, almost to the end, and you turn right, you're in his driveway. So his house was on, you drive in, his house was on the right, and there was some steps to another house on the left. So it's a big circle driveway. So it was an ABC program. Steve Binder was the director. And so they just filmed a dance sequence in the driveway, the round driveway. So I didn't participate in it, had no idea about it. When the show aired, evidently, when the show aired, there was filming of the dance sequence, and as the camera panned around, it caught the front steps of the next door neighbor.
So are we talking right of privacy now?
Yeah.
Okay.
The neighbor then sued right of privacy. There is no right of privacy of pictures of somebody's house. There is no such thing. I made a motion to dismiss. It was not granted. And so the attorney for the plaintiff decided to take Phil's deposition. So he noticed the deposition. He had his office in the valley. So we go there. That's when I got there. The court reporter is there. The attorney, the plaintiff's attorney is there, and waiting for Phil. Phil comes in carrying a case. I didn't think anything about it. He sits down, opens the case, pulls out stenotype equipment, and sets it up, puts the paper in there, and the attorney asks him, "What are you doing?"
We'll pause. All right, go ahead, continue.
Anyway, so the attorney says to him, what are you doing? Phil says, "I'm a court reporter. I'm going to take down what you're saying." Indeed, Phil, in slow times, went and got his court reporter certificate. He did have a court reporter certificate. So he warmed up his hands, he did it, and the attorney started questioning him. And he questioned him, and an hour goes by, 2 hours go by, 3 hours go by. Phil hasn't touched the machine. Finally, the attorney pauses and said, "I noticed that you haven't touched the machine." And Phil, obviously waiting for this, said, "You haven't said anything worth writing down." It was a great moment.
That's one of the best stories I've ever heard. But what did the lawyer do in response, if anything?
He just continued on.
So he did not get his court reporter like license in anticipation of his deposition. He did not know if he was going to make it as a producer or something, and needed a backup.
That's right. That was his backup.
It's a good segue.
Then I had an appeal pending for the denial of the motion to dismiss, and the day before the court was going to rule, the lower court was then, thing was pending, and I know it. Then the upper court evidently called the lower court and said, "You better reverse yourself."
They called them.
Yeah.
Is that how it worked back then?
He then advised us that he was reversing his ruling and dismissed the case.
That's interesting. I don't want to get too far afield, but I don't think that happens anymore, where the appellate court just calls the lower court and says reverse.
Well, because there was no such thing
as a right of privacy for the front of your house.
That's correct.
So I was going to say it was a good segue, because speaking of, Phil Spector thinking maybe I'm not going to make it as a producer or in the music industry, and he had a backup. So since we're talking about the 1960s, actually even before that, going to the 1950s, I think you were barred in 1953. I think.
No, I came here in 1951.
Yeah, but I looked on the State Bar website. It says you were 1953, January 1953.
53, yeah.
Okay, so at that time, so let's go back to the 50s.
But I wasn't practicing law in 53.
No, I know. That's what I want to talk about. So when the time that you were barred, you took the bar, you were a working musician at that time.
I was a working musician. When I took the bar, I was actually working when I studied for the bar. I was working at the Last Frontier Hotel in Las Vegas with a band, Lorraine Cugat band.
How did you? Okay, well, why did you? If you were playing as a musician, was taking the bar and the concept of practicing law your backup plan?
No, I just since I'm out here. And I'm sitting in Las Vegas, and it's 115 degrees out, and it was impossible to go outside, basically, in those days. So I just said, let me get the bar review course, and while I'm sitting here all day long, I might as well do something, and so I studied for the bar.
So you studied for the bar, but you obviously went to law school before you studied for the bar.
Yeah, I graduated law school in 51.
So in 51, or when you went to law school, you still at that point wanted to be a professional musician.
Well, I was. In other words, I finished law school. I worked my way through all the way through school playing. That's how I paid my tuition. I worked all the way through. I went to music school at the same time. I wasn't a full-time music student, but went to DePaul had the law school and the music school in the same building. So I went. My law classes were 9 to 12 in the morning, and at 1 o'clock I went downstairs from the law class to the music school, and spent the next several hours in the music school. Then I would go home and study, and then I work a gig at night. So when I finished law school, and one of the guys at the music school said, the Larry Fotine band needs a saxophone player. Are you available? I said, great. So I finished law school, took the bar exam in Illinois, and the day after I finished the bar exam, I left with that band and went to New York.
So you took the Illinois bar,
yeah.
And then, so was it when you were in Vegas, you were studying for the California bar?
Yeah.
And how long did you study for the California bar?
Several weeks.
Because most people I studied 3.5 months to take the bar.
I didn't study 3.5. I didn't have 3.5 months. I studied while I was in the Vegas engagement, which was 2 or 3 weeks, and then I came and finished up in California another week or two, and then took the bar.
So when you were playing, what was the name of the band you were playing with?
That one, it was the Lorraine Cugat Band, directed by Van Alexander.
Now, at some point, though, you started playing with, among others, Frank Sinatra, which is an interesting story, and I think I have a note here. You actually played with, I think, Frank Sinatra, Les Brown, Nat King Cole,
Yeah.
Charlie Barnett, Bobby Darin, Maynard Ferguson. Those are all big names.
Yeah.
So how did you start playing with those? How did you meet Frank Sinatra? Let's start with the biggest.
I got called. You would get a call. You have built a reputation as a musician, and you get a call. So I got a call on one day. I remember where I was. We all had answering services. My answering service was called Call 9. We didn't know cell phones, remember?
Yes.
So how did they reach you? So musicians then, singers had answering services. So there's a squirrel out there. Don't wake him.
No, you won't see it.
So we had an answering service. So you get your calls. Yeah, we need you for a session tonight, or we need you. You're available for the next couple of weeks to go out with this band. And that's how.
How long or how much did you play with Sinatra?
Sinatra, well, I went up to Vegas and played with him there for a few weeks at the Sands Hotel. Came back, and then I was asked to go with him to Australia for a tour in the Far East, including Australia. We went and got to Hawaii, where we were going to change planes, and then Sinatra got into a fight with the airlines because he brought along Jimmy Van Heusen, a songwriter, and he never told Qantas Airlines he was bringing him, and Qantas said, we don't have a seat for him, but we'll be on the next flight. Sinatra had a temper tantrum and said, we're not going, and canceled the tour. We stayed in Hawaii and came back. And then a week later, I got a call from him, or his pianist, Bill Miller, and we went into the Macambo with a fabulous band. For 10 nights, he did it for free, paid everybody himself, because he was doing a favor for Charlie Morrison, who died, and he was doing a favor for his widow. And we went there for 10 nights, sold out. It was with the most incredible band. It was fabulous engagement. And then he wasn't doing anything for a while, and so I started freelancing around, and then I was working with the LA Philharmonic. And then I get other calls. You go from one to another.
And so, but Nat King Cole, at least because I know that you were representing the Nat King Cole
later,
estate.
much later.
That you played with him, or did you?
I played with him.
But in the early years, you played with him, and then later represented his estate. So how well did how did that transpire? Like you were playing with Nat King Cole, and then one day you're representing his estate.
Yeah, well, one day.
I'm sorry. What year were you playing with Nat King Cole? I mean, was it still in the 50s?
All my major playing was through the 50s into the beginning 60s.
Okay. So at this time, you got a call, it sounds like, and you played with Nat King Cole, but sounds like maybe you got to know him a little?
Not a lot. Not a lot.
Okay, so was it random when you started representing the Nat King Cole estate?
Well, I got a call from, I can't remember, I think it's the business manager for the estate.
Now, three
It was
things.
not connected to the music.
Okay, all right. So three things I'm interested in. First of all, my recollection was that your first client was David Rose.
First significant client in music was David Rose. It was not my very first client. My very first clients were my fellow musicians who were getting...
Oh, I'm going to come back to that. But David Rose wrote The Stripper, and right?
Well, and he was Bonanza also.
He wrote Bonanza.
He was the musical conductor and composer of Bonanza.
So, do you recall about what year that was?
I don't. I don't exactly. He's probably in the 60s. There was a copyright issue that he had in San Francisco, and I got a call from his manager, whose name I don't remember right now, and he asked me about is a copyright issue. I said, "What's the issue?" He told me, so I quickly went out and got a copy of the Copyright Act, which was only about this thick at that time. And we have to fly to San Francisco to have this meeting. So I studied the Copyright Act on the plane, and I got there and I was ready for them for the question.
Yeah, and that's what I was going to ask about, because I love that story. The fact that they asked you, my recollection was not that I was around at this point in time, but they asked you, do you know anything about copyright law? And you said yes, but you didn't, but you went and bought a book.
Correct.
And so, which is a lesson for, I guess, any aspiring attorneys. Don't say no. And I know that because you talk about practicing door law, that you used to practice door law. If it came in the door, you would take it. And this is one of those things. So you said, yeah, I know all about copyright law. And
I never used those words.
Which words?
I know all about copyright.
Not all about copyright law, but you know copyright law, but you really didn't, but you did learn it between the time you were from here to San Francisco and taking one of those, propeller planes up there?
Before jets. It was
before jets, so it was like an hour and a half flight.
Correct.
And maybe a little wait at the airport, and
Correct.
and you learned copyright. And what happened in that meeting? You knew enough to
I knew enough
pass.
to get done what had to be done.
And do you remember what the issue was?
No.
Was that, and so that was your first venture into copyright law. And so was it before that? Because I do want you to tell the story about how you basically started practicing law, because you had some, we've talked a little bit about this, and you've told this story. You had some friends. Now, we're talking in the 1950s, and rock and roll in the 1950s was still sex, drugs, and rock and roll, basically, but it was not rock and roll at this point. It was blues, it was jazz.
No, yeah, it wasn't rock and roll at that point, or much of it. But what it was simple. It was not very complicated. I'm sitting at a record date, or I'm sitting at a concert that we're doing, and somebody says, "Hey, I just got busted for possession. Can you help me out?" And it was easy because musicians never carried knives or guns or resisted arrest. They're very passive. And we'd finish, we'd finish a gig on Sunset Strip, because I worked all the clubs, the Macambo, the Crescendo, the Interlude, the Ciro's, etc. And at 2 o'clock in the morning, when everything closed down, the cops would be backstage. They open your case. So they open the case, so there'd be some marijuana. Sometimes there'd be some heroin.
You gonna get that?
Yeah, and
Hang on.
it was
Go ahead.
clearly illegal search and seizure.
Leo, down. Leo, down. Off.
And so there was a thing called, I think it was called the 995 motion, a dismissal for no probable cause. And so it was easy. I'd go down to court, make a motion under 995, get the case dismissed. So I'm sitting there. Can you read this record contract? Can you read this publishing contract? Can you read this movie contract?
So these are your musician friends asking you to do this while you're sitting in court on a motion to have a criminal matter dismissed.
Right.
And and so I know you like to say, as a result of that, if it wasn't for drugs, you would not be practicing law. Right? That's your motto. But so again, this was in the 1950s. But you was this after you went and did the thing with David Rose? Because if you're reading record contracts and publishing contracts, you must have known a little bit of copyright at this point.
Yeah, at that point, it was probably around the same time. I can't tell you what came before what.
Okay, so then David was your
First significant entertainment.
And was it shortly thereafter you began representing Nancy Wilson? Right?
It wasn't long after I got a call. Like I got a call from Phil Spector, I got a call from Andy Feynman. In this case, I got a call from her then husband, Kenny Dennett, call Nina. My answering service. Remember I said my answering service is call Nina?
I didn't catch the name, Nina. Okay.
Call Nina is my answering service. Now, I've got an office set up. I was representing Phil, and